Testing, testing, testing. Yeah? Okay. Great. So you guys are going to need headphones to be able to hear because it's all, the mic goes to the headphones. I mean, yeah, that's fine. But if I move, good point. There was a panel earlier where you have to, yeah, you have to pass it. So, and there's just the one. We've ordered many more. They haven't arrived. So it's under your chair. Yeah. You'll need headphones to hear. We are. We are. I don't know. I know. Yeah. Welcome. Can people hear me? There we go. Welcome to the American is All in Action Center. This is our opening event, and we're very pleased to have you. We are going to be hosting programming over the next 3 days, so please take a look at all of the programming that we have available on the America is All In website. America's All In was made for this moment, from our origins in America's Pledge and the We Are Still in Declaration of 2017 through to the advocacy for and implementation of historic U.S. federal legislation like the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law. The last 7 years of work by this coalition have shown us that subnational climate leadership is crucial in any federal environment, but now that's more true than ever. As you'll see throughout the programming, states, cities, corporations, tribes, institutions of culture, health, and higher education are here to highlight their climate leadership, identify opportunities for collaboration, and prove collectively that subnational climate action can lead to economy-wide results that the U.S. public deserve. We know that cities, states, businesses, and other institutions have significant power to make progress on climate, and when they are committed, as so many of them are, they get stuff done. We have a lot of successes to point to, even given the setbacks of the recent federal election. Voters in Washington state upheld the Cap and Invest law. IRA has an amazing track record and just turned 2 years old, having created 330,000 jobs and $360 billion in investment. It is now a bipartisan supported law, having 18 House Republicans writing publicly that it needs to be maintained. Cities are investing in public transit in a way that support all communities. To our international partners and allies, U.S. climate leadership will continue, and the All-In Coalition represents nearly 2/3 of the U.S. population and 3/4 of its GDP. There's no shortage of governors, mayors, businesses, and community leaders ready to do what's needed to reduce carbon emissions and build a safer, healthier future for generations to come. America's All In and its partners recognize that every part of our economy and our society need to work together to meet the challenges of the climate crisis. So let me now introduce our panel representing 4 different sectors of the economy. Melisa Logan, Mayor of Blytheville, Arkansas, also representing the Mississippi River Towns Initiative. Patrick Hamilton, a longtime America's All In Leaders Circle member and fellow at the Science Museum of Minnesota. Sarah Aminzadeh, Deputy Secretary of Natural Resources Agency for the State of California. And Chief Procurement Sustainability Officer of Mars Incorporated, and another America's All In Leaders Circle member. So, Barry, let me start with you. Corporate climate leadership comes in many forms, and we've seen that some corporations are loudly shouting their climate commitments, and others are not touting any actions that they're taking on climate in the same way that they did years ago. How important is corporate climate leadership, And what does that look like?
Great to be here, and thank you for inviting us. It's crucially important, and we think climate leadership is all about following through on your decoupled our emissions back in 2018, and our intention is to show and demonstrate that you can do this. We've set a goal of minus 50%, and this is full scope, everything in. By 2030, and we have a plan to do that, and we're cracking on and are going to get it done, and we want to demonstrate through our delivery, through our performance, that you can grow the business and you can decouple emissions, and I think that's the best thing we can do to show that you don't need to compromise between business performance and doing your job. I think that's the key message. And when we published that roadmap, we said not only is it entirely achievable to get to minus 50% by 2030 with current technology, but it's entirely affordable. And we've said, and we're investing 1 point of earnings a year. So we're a $50 billion business. That's $500 million a year we're investing in climate change actions. And we're going to continue to do that because that's what it's required. I think the problem is that most corporations are not yet ready to invest that sort of money, and that's what it's going to take.
Thank you. I think it'd be interesting. We're at COP, and we have a number of international partners here. Work to shore up its supply chain through actions around the world. If you could speak to some of the climate impacts that you're seeing internationally and what that's doing for how you're needing to manage that in the work.
Well, you're talking about what are the impacts on our business. Yeah, of course, we're starting to see the impacts of a warmer planet. And we source raw materials from more than 100 countries around the world. And we all know that as the planet warms, some parts of the world are going to really suffer. And in particular, the poorest people are going to suffer the most. So we have about 1 million farmers in our supply chain. Many smallholder farmers in Africa and Asia, Latin America, and they're the ones that are starting to get hit first. So our job is to both ensure that we do our job not to warm the planet, but also to work with those farmers to increase their resilience. And that's fundamentally about increasing their incomes and increasing the diversification of their incomes. So we've programs all over the world to do that.
Thank you. Sarah? California, in many ways, is a leader on climate policy. As Deputy Secretary of the Natural Resources Agency for the state of California, what are you most excited about? What is where do you see climate impact really being addressed?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for having us here. I'm really proud, especially in this moment, that California has been leading on climate for many years and will continue to lead on climate. I was just saying that, I was speaking with my husband this morning about the fact that I was doing an America is All In panel, and he said, but are we? And what I'm really hoping is that by the end of this COP that, it's not America is all in ? It's America is all in ! And I think that California is a big part of that in terms of our zero emission vehicle goals and standards. We've exceeded our own targets for that. 1 in every 4 cars in California is a zero emission vehicle. We are on track to meet our renewable energy goals. We're scaling wind and solar at incredible rates. So I would say that we're proud in California, and we are sort of stoically focused on continuing to lead regardless of what I would call a dynamic federal landscape. And we're not alone. We are partnered with 24 other states. We represent 55% of the American population, more than that of GDP. And, California has the 5th largest economy in the world. So it really matters what we do. And we have shown and will continue to show that we can not only meet our ambitious climate targets, but we can also have a thriving economy. And we can also prioritize conservation.
That leads into my next question. So thank you for providing that bridge. How do you balance the climate goals with nature, conservation, biodiversity, the sort of broader goals that we all have?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I would say that I don't necessarily think of it as balancing nature with climate goals. I think nature is a part of and helps drive our climate goals, whether we're restoring wetlands that can help sink carbon or conserving lands that can serve as hope spots for species that have to migrate or have warmer conditions. We have extremely ambitious, what you might call nature targets. We aim to conserve 30% of all of our lands and coastal waters by 2030, permanently conserve. And we're at about 25.2%. Depending on what happens in the next couple of months, we could be at 26%. But we have extremely ambitious biodiversity and nature-related targets, as well as climate emissions reduction targets. And we're hoping to show the world that we can do both. At times there is somewhat of a tension. Maybe we want to put a marine sanctuary somewhere where we're also hoping to develop offshore wind. But it's a tension that we're actively embracing and addressing. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Patrick, over to you. Cultural institutions play an important role, both in reducing emissions across their footprint, but also by translating complex climate science in a way that people actually understand, that resonates with them. You are in the communities, you are part of the community, and in many ways a voice for the community. And so what role do you see cultural institutions, representing the Science Museum of Minnesota in this climate fight?
Good point, and thank you for that question. And I think that what science museums and other cultural institutions do well is storytelling. And so I want to tell just a quick story about what is happening in Minnesota right now. So on the morning of the election, I'm coming downstairs, and my wife is on the sofa. She hears me coming downstairs, and she turns her head and she shouts back up to me, "Your hometown's in the newspaper." So my hometown is Moorhead, Minnesota. You probably haven't heard of it, but you're probably more familiar with the sister city across the Red River in North Dakota, made famous or infamous by the Coen brothers and their namesake 1996 movie Fargo. Well, Fargo and Moorhead are in the center of the Red River Valley, the Moorhead side of the river has been represented for 30 years by Colin Peterson, a conservative Democrat, but he lost his seat in Congress in 2020 to a very conservative Republican who easily won re-election just a few days ago, signaling the continuing shift of rural America to the right. So I walked around the sofa, took my seat down, and she hands me the newspaper, and in the top of the business section is the headline, "Moorhead lands $5 billion plant." Moorhead, and so I delve into it. Turns out this company called DG Fuels in Washington, D.C. has committed itself to building a $5 billion plant in Moorhead to make sustainable aviation fuel out of agricultural and timber waste resourced in the surrounding area. So our president-elect is all about drill, baby, drill. But most states in the U.S. do not have oil and gas reserves, but they all have agricultural sectors. And so they're all producing agricultural waste that could be repurposed. This plant that will be constructed in Moorhead will have 650 permanent jobs when it opens. And they estimate that it will catalyze another $50 billion in economic activity in the region in the next few decades. And it's also going to produce 193 million gallons of sustainable aviation fuel annually. And when I read that, I thought, that sounds like a big number. But I did a little research, did a little bit of math, and that's less than 1% of the aviation fuel that the United States will consume in 2030. So there's room to grow the market in sustainable aviation fuel. And what I'm encouraging culture institutions and all of you to do is look for those opportunities to tell the stories about how the Inflation Reduction Act is the goose laying golden eggs across rural America.
Thank you, Patrick. One of the other things, of course, that cultural institutions do is they connect with youth and other groups who may not either have a lot of deep knowledge on climate change or a long history of thinking about climate change. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to that, sort of the role that they play with youth or, people who don't think about these issues on a daily basis like we all may.
Yeah. Well, we're using the Science Museum of Minnesota actually as a living example of what's possible, about how addressing climate change is also an opportunity to create economic activity. So a decade ago, we installed advanced heat recovery at the Science Museum of Minnesota for multiple reasons. We did it because we wanted to save on the amount of energy that we use to power the Science Museum of Minnesota. We wanted to make the building more comfortable for our visitors. And from my perspective, being a climate scientist, I wanted the Science Museum to demonstrate how buildings could dramatically reduce their emissions of greenhouse gases. So we're saving $150,000 a year. That goes toward a scientific and educational mission as opposed to utility bills. And we've made the building actually a living example of what's possible, about how we can dramatically improve the performance of buildings, because they're 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. So we don't get to a cleaner, greener, climate-friendly United States without, in part, getting through creating more efficient buildings. And we're not going to build our way out of that problem. We're going to have to retrofit a vast pool of buildings in the United States in order to accomplish that work.
Yep, great. Mayor Logan, thank you for being here. The Mississippi River Basin is being impacted by climate change in a myriad ways, and I'm just wondering how you, as a mayor on the basin and also representing the Mississippi River Cities and Towns Initiative, how those communities are addressing that increased climate risk.
First of all, I would like to say good morning and thank you for allowing us to participate on this panel. MRCTI is the organization that I wholeheartedly represent and advocate for. We are the Mississippi River Cities and Towns Initiative. We are 105 mayors along the mighty Mississippi River. Our genesis starts in Bemidji, Minnesota, at the headwaters of the Mississippi River, and we run all the way down through America, and we empty into the Gulf of Mexico. So you're talking about 10 states, and again, 105 of us who are internationally advocating for safe water. Mm-hmm. And I want to give you a little history of the Mississippi so you can understand why it's so significant. The Mississippi River currently provides 1 of 12 out of every 12 meals that are served in the world comes off of the Mississippi River Basin. We are a $1 trillion food producer along the Mississippi River, right there in the United States. 20 million people gain their water from the Mississippi River. So if something happens along the Mississippi River Basin, the power of that is felt across national lines, across international waterways. It affects everything that happens in the world. And so we're here to protect it. And so what do? A small mayor like me, why would that be important? Well, my city of Blytheville is a part of a county that's the largest steel producer in the world. We are home to Nucor Yamada, Big River Steel, US Steel, and High Bar. So anywhere in the world you might look and there's a piece of steel that came from Blytheville, Arkansas. But if my river is not transportable and it's not flowing properly, then I can't get steel to the rest of the world. So as an advocate for the Mississippi River Cities and Towns Initiative, we've partnered, and what we do is we advocate for partners, for investment, for advocacy for the health of the water. And what do we do? So currently we are in a partnership with Ducks Unlimited to deploy 100,000 acres of natural infrastructure, wetlands, so that in flood season it absorbs the water. And then in drought season, it releases the water so that those barges have a waterway to move up and down the mighty Mississippi River.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I was wondering, if you can expand a little bit on the natural infrastructure and sort of what that looks like. I mean, it can take many forms, of course, and more than others. It is cool. And what does that look like?
Can you repeat that? I think you were kind of...
Oh, it wasn't working. Okay. I'm going to come over and help.
No.
Is that working? Okay. So it was question about the natural infrastructure and sort of what can is tool.
Okay, so I guess your question is, why is natural infrastructure so critical, and why we're using it as a tool? Think about it. There is a prediction that 90% of the population will live in urban areas by 2050. And so how do we expand? We usually expand out. And so our history has served us that we put in barriers, we've dammed the river. We've built cities along the river to cause interruption in the flow of the river. And so deploying the natural resources is just redeeming the water. So we're redeeming the water and building a different type of health for the water. And so that's why we're deploying natural infrastructure. It's also going to be a carbon emissions trapper. We're going to sequester, the carbon that is being emitted into the environment by deploying this natural resource. So currently, our goal in the next few years is to sequester about 160,000 tons of carbon, and hopefully in a few years past that, increase that, double that to maybe 320,000 carbon emissions, then tons of carbon emissions, and then keep duplicating that so that by 2030, which is our goal, I think that's everyone's goal, that we're almost at 0% carbon emissions along that Mississippi River. So it's just critical to find ways. Migratory birds, about 60% of all North American migratory birds use the Mississippi River. So it's really critical to keep that environment clean because, as we all know around the world, water is life.
Yeah, that's great. And I guess one more question is, yours is a bipartisan group, and I'm just wondering, in the United States, there are times when saying climate change can be seen as something political. Shouldn't be, it's the science, but there we are. I'm just wondering, how do you talk about it to bring communities into the discussion in a way that is impactful?
So you have to take the policy, if you will, out of it.
Yep.
And we know that climate change is not a political issue, it's a human issue. And so what affects us in the U.S. affects around the world. It's an international problem. It's a world issue. And so I think just the contingency is to treat it like it's a human issue and not a political issue. And so MRCTI is a bipartisan organization. We're Republican, we're Democrat, we're independent, but we're human. And so we do want to keep that in the forefront of everyone's mind, that no matter who's in charge, this human issue will still exist. This problem belongs to every one of us, and every one of us as a citizen of whatever nation needs to own the fact that we have a responsibility to our human nature to keep our environment clean.
Yeah. And actually, I want to bring Sarah in a little bit. I think it would be helpful to understand. The state of California, 5th largest economy in the world, but you have partners at all levels of government, clearly, private sector partners, cultural institutions, healthcare institutions, higher ed, of course. How does that work? How do you build those coalitions within the state of California, bringing mayors in, other partners in? What does that look like?
Yeah, we are a member of the U.S. Climate Alliance. We are a member of the Under 2 Coalition of local governments, municipal authorities. So we are partnered with our local mayors. I'm really inspired, frankly, to hear Mayor Logan speak about the bipartisan nature of the Mississippi Rivers Cities and Towns Initiative, because I think that's something that we actually have work to do in California and in many other areas of the country. It can be very polarizing, but it really shouldn't be. And I think that's work that sort of animates us to see, okay, how can we just look at the issues that are affecting our communities? Like in California, wildfire, drought, extreme heat. These are very real human issues that dramatically impact the lives and livelihoods of every single California. And I think it's really on us to find ways to do that work, across the aisle. And when we do that, I think it will create pathways to do that more so across the country. Because it's true, climate change really shouldn't be a partisan issue. So that's something that really animates us. And At the same time, we are already a member, and I think in many instances help found networks that extend far beyond our state. We heard Governor Jay Inslee speaking today about the founding of the Climate Alliance, and we're also looking for partnerships outside of our borders, to the north in Canada and to the south in Mexico. We're really encouraged by the different ways that we can connect, across borders, across regions, to really show the world that America is still all in, and that we can do this regardless of what is happening in DC.
Yeah. Barry, I'm curious if you could speak a little bit to sort of the role that you can play, even those who are not able to be quite as loud, but, just sort of being part of the conversation, and the importance that, having a corporate voice at some of these discussions, the role you play there.
First of all, I think the work that all of the subnational actors is doing a fabulous work, and this is key to us moving forward. And even California, fifth largest economy in the world, they set the rules. So if California legislates, then we're not going to create a separate supply chain for California. So we then change what we're doing for the whole of the U.S. So you're crucially important, and keep going. I said before, the primary thing, we've always followed the science, and the science says we've got to get to net zero. And the primary thing we can do is continue to demonstrate that you can do both. You talked about doing both. You can run a great business that's growing and successful and tackle climate change. So, that's our number one objective. And I think what you're going to see over time is us continuing to demonstrate that that's possible. We're also generally in favor of legislation, and because we know from experience that voluntary action only takes you so far, whether that's on climate or on packaging. You tend to get the leading companies moving first, and we start to move ahead. But then we need legislation, whether that's in Europe or in states or wherever around the world. So you'll see our voice behind legislation. So, for example, the Global Plastics Treaty, the final negotiations are in Busan in 2 weeks' time. We've been a major part of the industry initiative, the coalition, the business coalition, to advocate for a high-quality compulsory treaty, because that's what's going to accelerate the change on packaging. And wherever we can do the same on climate, we'll do the same. So we'll advocate for policies that are in line with the science, wherever they are in the world. And we're just going to keep going. So, if you follow the science, you follow where the emissions are. And so if we've got emissions in the US that need abating, we're going to carry on doing that work. And so you'll see us building many more wind farms, many more solar farms in the US as our business grows. You'll see us working with farmers in the US on regenerative agriculture, and helping them through the transition to regenerative agriculture. And you'll see us redesigning our packaging to be lower carbon footprint. You'll see us changing our logistics footprint to lower modes of transport. So wherever there are emissions in the world, we're going to carry on going after them. And there are a lot of emissions still in the US for us to go after. So we're just going to keep going.
Yeah. And you spoke to legislation, which I think is really important, right? And considering, the state of the U.S. Congress, sort of imagining an IRA 2.0 is probably off the table, right? But there are opportunities, and you also mentioned Europe, and I think that's interesting too, and what that dynamic is like as far as, corporates being in the position where they need to respond to legislation in a variety of countries. Europe is maybe more forward-leaning in some ways, and the United States in others. What does that balance look like, and how do you manage it?
Well, look, we're a global business, as I say, operating in 190 countries, and our sustainability plan was very deliberately called Sustainable in a Generation, because we knew it was going to take a generation to solve this. And we launched that plan in 2017. There's another 20 years or so to go of that. And, every government in the world will have changed over 2 or 3 times during the cycle of that plan. So just keep going. And we're also demonstrating that, frankly, we can get this done with or without government. Of course, helpful legislation will help us do it faster. But more importantly, it'll help others do it. We're going to do it whether we have incentives or not. I think many companies are not going to do it unless they get more government help. So I think you are going to see some slowdown if government policies are not helpful. But in other parts of the world, there's 195 countries we can operate in, and so carbon emissions are universal. So wherever you can make progress, we need to make progress. I do think the agenda is being set by progressive countries and organizations at the moment, though. So, Europe is generally ahead of America. California are often in line with Europe, and they're setting the pace in terms of helpful, supportive legislation and the right legislation. So I think they'll continue to do that. And, we'll follow the best legislation. We'll advocate for the legislation that's in line with the science.
Yeah, that's great. So we've talked about global, local. Patrick, I want to go down to the community level, right? And because of, again, Science Museum of Minnesota, Twin Cities is it's progressive, but increasingly more diverse, community. And I'm wondering sort of how do you incorporate those voices into the discussion? How do you consider, bringing in the voices and the opinions of new immigrants into the discussion on climate change in the United States? And what does that look like, when you think about that from a science museum perspective?
Sure, thank you. So a year ago, the Science Museum of Minnesota adopted a new strategic plan. And there's a Venn diagram that actually put climate change right at the center of that work. And so what we're going to be doing is actually using climate change as a way of integrating all of our exhibit halls across the museum. So whether it's the Human Biology Hall or the Paleontology Hall or engineering and problem solving, we're going to be using climate change as a unifying theme for all those exhibit halls. And then partnering with local communities and those groups to bring them in and bring those voices into the Science Museum. And then actually going beyond the Twin Cities metropolitan area. So we are developing a partnership with the Headwaters Science Center, which is in Bemidji, the headwaters of the Mississippi River, to actually partner with them to bring our science, technology, and engineering and math resources out to that community, and that they in turn can then take them out to their communities, because Minnesota is a large state, and when you get beyond the Twin Cities metropolitan area, sparsely populated, and so we're looking for partners so that we can leverage our resources, both our climate change resources and our other educational resources, to actually bring STEM education to communities throughout the state that have been underserved.
That's fantastic. I love that. I wanted to see if there is a question or two from the audience. Consider that. Think about it. I'll come back to you. But first, let's come back to you guys with the U.S. election has global implications. There are partners. Yeah. Once I put these on, I'm quieter. The U.S. election has global implications. We know that. And a number of partners are a little bit worried about where things are headed. What gives you hope? What are you most excited about? Where do you think we can actually lean in and do more collectively? And
You want to start?
do I want to start?
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So my personal action plan after leaving COP29 is I'm going to write a letter to Member of Congress Michelle Fischbach, and also the Member of Congress in North Dakota, Kelly Armstrong. They're both conservative Republicans. I'm not actually going to send it to them, though. I'm going to send it to friends and family and colleagues that live in their districts, because 18 Republican members of Congress signed on to a letter back in August to the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, asking him to protect the energy tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act. And I think that we all have a role to play to encouraging our Republican colleagues in rural areas to really realize that the Inflation Reduction Act is the economic employment opportunity of a lifetime for their communities. And it would be to their benefit and to our benefit to have the Inflation Reduction Act avoid the animus of President-elect Trump taking it apart.
I just want to come right behind you and say that as a part of the U.S. government, we were able to meet with some of the U.S. delegation on yesterday, and they more than 100% assured us that there will not be an IRA Part 2. But that doesn't negate the hope that we have. So as the coalition of mayors up and down the Mississippi River, you have to think about it collectively, and I really applaud your ideal of actually writing a letter to the representatives but disseminating them amongst the community because it'll have a greater impact, which is why we are a coalition of mayors. So as a rural mayor with a population of 15,000, I might mean very little, and my issue might be minimized based on how I fit in the larger scheme of things. But as 105 mayors along the Mississippi River, as a coalition of mayors with issues with cities of 800,000, we become millions in population. And so that voice strengthens as we come together across partisan lines to say, listen, we are here as a people and not as a political party. Please continue the work of the IRA.
Yeah, I would say a couple of things on this. First, I don't believe that the election of President-elect Trump was a referendum on climate. I think we've seen that businesses and, to your point, representatives across the spectrum recognize that climate is a real issue, whether or not they call it climate. And, most importantly, I think, we had the CEO of Exxon say a few days ago, he thinks it would be a bad decision if Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement. That's kind of an earth-shattering revelation, and it's a reflection of we're in a very different place now than we were in 2016 during the first election. Thanks to the leadership of, I would say, the people on this stage, the people in this building, we are on the road to reducing our emissions meaningfully. The private sector is fully engaged and locked in, and this administration may slow things down, they may make it more difficult, but I think, to the point of this pavilion, we're all in. We are committed to, a straight line down to net zero. And it's so much bigger than, this one election or this one administration. So, I took a beat. I was disappointed. But we've been here before, and we're way more organized than we were before. And the private sector is fully engaged. I mean, I never thought I would be, referring to what the CEO of Exxon is doing as something positive and hopeful, but it really is. So.
Yeah, I want to build on that and sort of switch the emphasis from government to industry.
Yeah.
And I'll use us as an example. Mars's footprint is just under 30 million tons. That's the same size as Finland's. So our footprint is the size of a small country. And I've got customers, one in the room here. I've got suppliers whose footprints are way bigger than mine. Their footprints are the size of medium-sized countries. So your footprint probably isn't that big. But the point being, companies matter just as much as countries. And what we need to do is we need to get companies moving aggressively forward on this agenda. And then it matters less what countries are doing. In a simplistic way, if you could get the 1,000 biggest companies in the world truly on a path to net zero, it wouldn't matter what governments were doing. So we need to risk and manage this by getting companies to move at a faster pace. And actually that's the problem. So, yes, great if governments, legislation makes it more friendly, easier, but we are demonstrating that companies can do it irrespective of what the legislation is. And we need to get the other 1,000 biggest companies in the world moving in the same way. And why are they not? Because there's no transparency of actual performance. The conversation of the last 10 years has been about commitments. And everybody's made a net zero commitment. But nobody's being held to account on performance. And here we are at COP, where there's some level of holding countries to account on performance. There is no mechanism to do that for companies. And so my argument is companies are just as important as countries, and we need mechanisms to increase the transparency of performance and create a race to the top. And then you might get helpful legislation which is incentivizing that race to the top around the world. So let's not forget the company performance.
Great. All right. You've all had a minute to think about it. Are there any questions? Yeah. Can I borrow that? Thank you. Thanks, Kevin.
Hi, my name is Yoichiro. I'm a reporter from Japan. Sorry about my English.
Sorry, just 1 second so they can put their headphones on.
Sorry.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Yoichiro. I'm from Japan. I'm a reporter. And I want to ask, is there any direct criticism against Mr. Trump's attitude? Or are you going to carefully avoid the name calling and you want to keep it as a business and a science matter?
Does anyone want to take that?
I want to just assure the world that we will refer to Mr. Trump as President Trump. There will be no name calling. The people have spoken. He is indeed the president-elect. So I admire this panel for the approach that we're taking. The only work that we're concerned with is the work to move the climate action, Paris Agreement, the CHAMP model, TA, transformative adaptation, whatever we have to do to move those models forward. That's what we will do, and we will continue to refer to him after he's inaugurated as President-elect Donald Trump.
I'd like to speak to both of what you said and what you said, Sarah. He is the president-elect. But I'd also speak to your point that he did not get a mandate on climate change because climate change was hardly ever discussed during this election. So overwhelming majority of Americans accept the reality that human-caused climate change is real. So I think that we have an opportunity to work on this issue with our constituents about the fact that, particularly the Inflation Reduction Act, is an astonishing opportunity for economic, employment, equity, education, and environmental benefits for both rural and urban constituents, and we should move forward on it.
Yeah, thank you. I would just say, the United Nations was created before we knew what climate change was. And of course, so was the United States and all of our environmental laws. So one way to look at it is to say, well, this problem is outside of the structures that we've created and the governments we've created in any case, right? So therefore, we don't need to depend on or heavily rely on the structures that exist. And I will not take the bait of personally criticizing him. That's way above my pay grade. But if you want to find me after the panel, I'm happy to talk to you.
So I'm a Brit who works for a global company, and we operate in Japan. So I'm equally interested in the Japanese legislation as the US legislation. And life goes on, and we've got to get this done over the next 20 years. And as I said before, in that time, there'll be hundreds and hundreds of presidential changes across the world. And we need to just be steadfast and get on with the job.
Hear, hear. Any other questions? Okay. I would like to thank all of you for being here. This was a lovely discussion and really just speaks to, let me take this off speaks to the strength of the subnational movement. You all have independent individual voices, and yet collectively, it's quite powerful. So thank you for being here, for representing the work that we're all headed for and doing every day, and will continue to do no matter what's out there. So thanks very much.